Scott, tell us a little bit about your kind of lightning rod position during this last decade of turmoil within the medical / political, battle.
Well, thank you, Dr. Bach, for having me on your show. I don't really feel like I'm anything particularly special. I'm a small town kid and growing up in southern Minnesota in a town named Sleepy Eye. In that community, I think we sort of lived out those words, it takes a village to raise a child. Everybody helped. If I did something inappropriate that my mom and dad didn't know about, there was a good chance they would find out. I grew up in a wonderful family. My mom was my best friend and my dad was my hero. And I had 4 siblings. And we were sort of a typical Leave It to Beaver kind of family. I went to dental school first. And just as I was doing that, my mom died in her 40s of colon cancer. And that was really tough on me. I struggled with that grieving process. And I found that I really didn't like teeth. So dental school wasn't a good fit. So I went to the seminary, and during that year, I made a couple of big decisions. One, I decided to go into medicine, and 2, I was dating this really good-looking, wonderful, thoughtful girl, and I asked her to marry me, and we've been together now more than 45 years. I went into family practice, and that was a lot of fun. I found that the challenge of, if you will, extracting the meaningful part of a patient's history, along with listening to their heart, along with applying modern science to their situation, it was just a fascinating thing for me. And that's why on the eve of my 70th birthday, I have no intentions of retiring. I asked my wife if we could wait until I turn 80. And when we turn 80, then I'll have a serious conversation with her about retirement. Right now, I'm getting ready to finish up my medical boards for the American Board of Family Medicine. But as you asked about this last decade of tumult in organized medicine, for me, it started bizarrely enough. In 2015, I was recruited to run for the Minnesota Senate, and I didn't really feel desirous of being ever called a politician. I had served on the school board and done a lot of community things in terms of church council and Rotaries and Lions clubs. And I felt that that had been a substantial commitment to the community I lived in. But I was recruited to run for the Senate. And after a couple of months of holding people off, I said yes. And so I ran for the Senate. And right at that same time, the Minnesota Academy of Family Physicians notified me that I had been chosen as the family practice doctor of the year in the entire state of Minnesota. And I was grateful and flattered and humbled. And then I was elected to the Senate, and I received more votes than any other Minnesota senator had done. That same year in 2016, President Trump won. And we hadn't expected in Minnesota to take over the Senate, but we did, which meant that I was in the majority party. And that also meant that I would be getting pretty significant committee assignments. And lo and behold, I was the vice chair of the Health and Human Services Committee. And I also was asked during the course of that first session by the majority leader if I would be chair of the Healthcare Access and Affordability Subcommittee. And so I did that. After 4 years, my wife had some medical issues, and I'll be honest, the way the legislature works is frustrating. It is really hell-bent on gridlock, and both parties are to blame, but because the Republicans were in the majority party that term I was in, the Senate, I would have to say that the Republicans perhaps had the ability to break through that gridlock, but chose to not break through that gridlock. So those 4 years in Minnesota, when I was in the Senate, I didn't think we really maximized what we could do. And so I decided to not run for re-election in 2019. I thought that my political career was over. But then COVID hit. And I was in no way prepared for what my life was to become. It was like walking onto a dance floor, expecting to do a waltz with your wife, and all of a sudden they turn on some hyper rap music and you're supposed to try to dance to it. When I first spoke up in March of 2020 that I thought some of the lockdown policies in Minnesota were illogical and more based on backroom negotiations than they were on what was truly safe or non-safe or essential or non-essential. I expected, because I was in the Senate, I expected a conversation, but I didn't get that. Instead, I was ridiculed. And then when the Department of Health in Minnesota piggybacked on top of the CDC's request to change policies as to how we completed death certificates, and they emailed that to the physicians in Minnesota, I raised my hand and said, hold it. You're asking us to modify the way we do this. And I've been doing it the same way for 30 years. And what you're saying doesn't make sense. You don't put a contributing condition down as a cause of death. You do what the CDC has recommended for decades. And that's, as a physician completing a death certificate, you take the responsibility very seriously to identify the initiating event that began the patient's demise. So if a person starts with metastatic colon cancer and it progresses to a point where a patient chooses to be on hospice care, and everybody knows that the patient is going to succumb to this illness, and in the last day or two of their lives, they're exposed to COVID and they develop a cough, you don't put down the cause of death was COVID. You put down metastatic colon cancer. If you choose to, you can put COVID as a contributing condition, but we were told the rules are changing. And when I did that, Dr. Bach, I had no idea that I would be identified as some political whistleblower. And I just felt I was a physician carrying out my responsibility. And in the next couple of months, I didn't get a response as a senator from the Department of Health. What I got was the first ever investigation of my medical license from the Minnesota Board of Medical Practice. And so began a horrific adventure in my life as I got investigated 6 different times.
My
20
word.
different allegations.
That's unbelievable. You know, I've met you in person, and here it comes through clearly to our audience as well that you are a thoughtful, genuine, solid man of integrity, and clearly you have the experience, the wherewithal, the solidity, faith, and devotion within that kind of clearly bleeds from your personal and family and spiritual life into your professional. And so you're a man in full, and then to be taken down, by, I mean, I don't quote me on this, so much, but for people who are your clear, moral lessers, and who don't necessarily they have nothing on their side. They don't have the medicine on their side. They don't have the theory, and they go for you. It's a sadness.
For me, it was illuminating. I can't help but think of the Old Testament story about Jonah being called to go to Nineveh, and he sort of shrugged his shoulders and said, "Oh no, that's going to be a pretty tough job. I think instead I'll go to the Mediterranean and take a cruise." And then a whale got in the way. And I sort of feel like there was a whale that got in my way, and all of a sudden it wasn't as if I was going to be able to step away quietly from a relatively brief political career. It became very apparent that I was in for the fight of my life. And not one of the complaints came from a patient of mine. None of them had anything to do with any healthcare services I provided. Several of the complaints had to do with social media tweets. Some of the complaints came from speeches I gave on the Senate floor or comments I made during a subsequent campaign to run for governor of Minnesota in 2022, it was clear to me that somehow we'd gotten so upside down in Minnesota that I evidently, in the Minnesota Board of Medical Practice's eyes, I evidently had given up some of my First Amendment rights regarding free speech when I became an MD, because I was being told I couldn't say these things on the Senate floor, or I couldn't make these comments during a political campaign. And I couldn't help but think, Dr. Bach, of people like Dr. Rand Paul in the US Senate and other physicians in the Senate who make speeches. And I asked myself, are they getting vilified and demonized and prosecuted and persecuted because they spoke their minds in a political debate? And so initially I didn't reach out to any attorneys. I just responded to the various complaints from the Board of Medical Practice, each time spending literally thousands of hours. And for the first 4 complaints, each of them was dismissed. But the 5th complaint occurred while I was running for governor, and that one was allowed to hang over my head during the entire governor campaign. And then when the governor's election was over and I had lost, I was notified by the Board of Medical Practice that my response did not satisfy them and that they would call me in for a hearing. And so not only did they do that, they also submitted a 6th investigation. And so we did have a hearing, and it was at that point in time that I felt I better get an attorney. So I hired an attorney, and then another nonprofit group joined our team, and the Minnesota Board of Medical Practice, after a 90-minute hearing, decided to dismiss all the charges against me without any disciplinary actions, and everything was closed. At that point in time, my attorneys and I felt the only real way to, if you will, somehow restore some sanity and some understanding that there has to be a line between free speech and professional conduct. And there's case law to support that. There was a case called NIFLA, N-I-F-L-A, NIFLA, that made it very clear that if there's not a relationship with the audience, then a person, a professional, can have free speech and can articulate contrarian opinions without having violated the standard of care in regards to professional conduct. Right. And that's what we were seeking to do. So I made the decision to go ahead and sue the Minnesota Board of Medical Practice. And we're still in process right now, trying to force the Minnesota Board to recognize that they have some guardrails in terms of their jurisdictional bounds. They don't get to, if you will, span the entire spectrum of speech. They have a narrow spectrum, and that is the speech that is associated with professional conduct. And that's what we like.
Also, there's the doctor-patient relationship, ostensibly. You know,
exactly.
You are an agent. You know, if you're a real estate agent, you know, your job is, say, buying and selling houses. So your job is with the, which either way, the purchaser or seller, and you have an object, the house. And that's your deal. And if you happen to think that, I don't know, you name it, that the Federal Reserve prints too much money or whatever. I mean, that may slightly impinge on your real estate market, but it doesn't have anything to do with your buying or selling that house. You're not engaging in any kind of fraud or deceptive behavior or poor behavior regarding that house. If you're really good at buying and selling the houses, and you happen to think, I don't know, that the Vikings are the best football team, and you put that out there, and they had, truthfully, let's say they're not. They're pretty good, but they're not great. Whatever. Can you be prosecuted for your language about your opinion about something that's totally extraneous to your actual profession? Buying and selling homes, or in this case, dealing with a patient, and that seems, wrong.
I like that comparison, Dr. Bach. I've actually never used that specific realtor, but buyer, seller, house. does that realtor get the chance to make comments about the interest rate, the Federal Reserve, economic policies, things like that? I think that's relative, and I think you're exactly right. So we're still in the middle of that. And to get to your original question, how has it affected me? I feel a little sad that as I approach the last decade or two of my life, I have to do it within the context of understanding that I have, I'm sure, thousands of people who think poorly of me. And I have to balance that with the fact that I have perhaps tens of thousands of people who respect me and appreciate the fact that I was a voice that was willing to speak up during the COVID pandemic, hopefully not in an overly bombastic or inflammatory manner, but in a manner that did strive to try to share the context of what we were doing. Because you and I know as physicians how important context is. I remember one time presenting a patient's case to a tumor conference, and it was a patient with metastatic prostate cancer. And we had people in the room far smarter than me. We had urologists and oncologists and radiologists. And after talking it over for 10, 20 minutes, there was a consensus. And that was plan A, which was radiation and this medicine, followed by monitoring for 3 months. And I asked the question as a family doctor and this patient's primary care doctor. I said, well, what do you think his current lifespan is right now if we do nothing? And they said, oh, probably 6 months. And that's pretty darn sobering. And so then I asked the next question. If we do plan A with the chemotherapy and the radiation, what can we do for this patient? And they said, oh, we can increase his lifespan probably by 30, 35%. And I said, okay, that's a third. So that's 2 more months. So now my patient gets to live 8 months instead of 6. And I asked, what will those 8 months look like? And the room got quiet because I'm just a lowly primary care doctor. I'm above my pay grade here. And finally, one of the oncologists spoke up and said, well, these chemotherapy agents we're talking about, they're pretty tough. There's going to be complete hair loss, a lot of diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, weight loss, feeling pretty miserable. But once we stop the chemotherapy after a couple of months, the patient will bounce back over a couple of months. And so me being sort of glib, I guess, I said, so 4 months of hell and then 4 months of saying goodbye.
Right.
And the room got quiet. I said, well, I will be sure to present these options to my patient. And
yeah.
No,
I think you make an excellent point. And I don't think you're above your pay grade. I think you're precisely where you should have been. And you were presenting the people's case in a sense.
But Dr. Bach, what it was all about was context. And I think that was what was so sorely missing in so many conversations regarding COVID was the context. I mean, if an 8-year-old's risk of dying from COVID is 0.00009 and the potential harm from a vaccine is 0.09, well, shoot a mile. It doesn't take an epidemiologist or a statistical PhD candidate to recognize that there's a good risk of harming a patient before there's any real risk or benefit available. And I think that there were people out there trying to be thoughtful and reasonable and provide context, and it just wasn't allowed.
No, it's an incredible sadness. I think that what was missing in our public health discussion from up on high was this personal element and the kind of the risk benefit equation you're talking about. 9-year-olds are not 90-year-olds. I just finished an article not too long ago for Brownstone on Dr. Fauci his self-proclaimed DNA of caring. That's what he thinks that he has since growing up in his dad's pharmacy and so forth. He just cares too much. But it's a funny article because I researched his own words, and he says, do you mind my Fauci accent? He says, during HIV, during the 1980s, we did everything from the top down. We weren't listening to the people. And he sees it as a big mistake. He was talking with, I think, Jonathan Capehart. I forget. Anyway, maybe not him, but he's going on that, if he had to do that over again, what he really learned from the HIV experience was that he should listen to the people, that the people, he may be doing the science, but people have their own position and they have their own thoughts about their own, illness and so forth. And he should have interacted with them and gave them a seat at the table. And he says this completely blithely, ignoring what happened during COVID and for lockdowns and so forth, where they didn't take any of this type of feedback into consideration. It's a huge sadness, and I don't know. So what's the next steps? How do we, I think the voices against some of this megalomania might be coming to power now. What are your thoughts about the Emperor Strikes? How do we kind of exact change in this system?
Well, I think, quite frankly, one of the most refreshing things that may happen in the next couple months is President-elect Trump bringing Robert Kennedy more into the everyday conversation. And I know Robert Kennedy evokes for some a certain apprehension about what might he do. But I think that apprehension will be replaced by a grudging respect as people start to tune into the conversation that Robert Kennedy brings to the table. Sometimes businesses talk about the need for a disruptor. Well, based on what we just went through, aren't we in need of a disruptor? Aren't we in need of bringing a skeptic to the table who can have the opportunity to lay out why such deep skepticism is a part of their DNA? I mean, Tony Fauci talking about HIV in the 1980s and the fact that he should have been listening more to the people is sort of astonishing, Dr. Bach, because just 4 years earlier in 1976 is when we had the Legionnaires' pneumonia, and we had the Philadelphia Convention with the American Legion people, and people got sick and died as the convention broke up and people went home. And physicians were using the best medicines and antibiotics they had available, trying to stop these pneumonia cases, and to no success and to no avail. People kept dying. But what did we do? Did we throw up our hands and say, oh, my stars, is there some leader at NIH that might tell us what to do? No, we kept as physicians listening and talking and listening and talking, and we tried things, and we stumbled upon a class of antibiotics that is old-fashioned called macrolides, and erythromycin is one of those drugs, and erythromycin stopped the dying. So we had a clear example in 1976. Don't get in the way of the doctor-patient relationship, because at the end of the day, nobody's going to care for that patient in the medical profession as deeply as that patient's doctor. The state medical society is not going to care for that patient like you and I will. So get the heck out of the way. And yet in COVID, we saw doctors absolutely shackled when patients said, can I please try this? Or can I please try this? Patients weren't being unreasonable. They were scanning the horizon to the best of their abilities. They were perhaps thinking along uncluttered lines that were more purely logical than what physicians and public health officials were doing. I mean, I know that public health officials were dismissing patients as being, well, they're just patients. They don't know any better. But actually, they did know better.
Oh, absolutely. And
we blew them off.
frankly,
We abandoned them. We betrayed them. And now we've got people like Tony Fauci and a variety of figures saying, oh, come on now, folks, we got to come together. We got to rebuild trust in public health. I'm sorry. This is going to be a long, arduous process, and it probably won't happen in my lifetime. But quite frankly, there were some really bad actors in the world of public health, and
yeah.
they don't get to demand forgiveness or renewed trust. They have to perhaps grovel at some level and earn it back. And
Well,
with the attitude that we're seeing,
they have to see their issues and they have to repent in a sense. You know, I've written 3 different articles that with Dr. Fauci in it, actually 4 for Brownstone, and this DNA of Caring article, I kind of delved quite a bit deeply into what I call Fauci 1.0 and his reboot, Fauci 2.0. So, you know, Dr. 1.0, say, you know, the original Fauci, maybe marginally more well-meaning. People argue over this topic. I'm not going to get into the minutia here, but Fauci 1.0 in 2005, I think, was talking about that year's influenza. And here's my Fauci again. You know, somebody asked him, should she get the flu shot after having had that specific flu, to which the flu shot was applicable? And he said, of course not. You should never get the flu shot for, you know, after you've had the illness. The illness itself is, you know, it's basically a panoply of antigens that the flu shot itself can't quite mimic, and there's no point in it. So Fauci 1.0 was not without his medical acumen, and he's a bright guy. I think he, you know, graduated summa cum laude or something like that from Holy Cross or whatever it was. And so the guy's bright enough, and he's bookish, and he calls himself kind of a nerd, whatever. I'm not saying the guy's, you know, wrong all the time, but Fauci 2.0 went against that. He went against the concept of natural immunity, and he went against the concept that vaccines precede an illness. And sort of this concept of booster for SARS-CoV-2, when SARS-CoV-2 had long left the scene. You know, we were treating with monoclonal antibody iterations specific to that strain, you know, the alpha strain, the beta strain, the delta strain, and so forth. And so you wouldn't give original SARS-CoV-2 antibodies you know, as treatment to somebody with Delta. You would give it specific, but yet they were doing that with the vaccine, which is basically the same thing, just running through your body first. And so he went back on his own dicta, and he knew full well the Diamond Princess data because he mentioned it in speeches and so forth, and never brought that to the public, that the death rate it had January landfall in Hong Kong, and there were 3,700 people on board, and there were basically 0 fatalities by the time we locked down in March, maybe 1. And ultimately by June, there were 10, but I don't even know they were attributable. And so, you know, he had all that in store, and I think he subverted his own Fauci 1.0 for this new iteration. You know, this, what he might consider an upgrade, but I consider a downgrade because he violated, you know, medical trust and probably his Hippocratic oath.
You know, Doctor, I have not read your articles about Tony Fauci, but if you would, after the program's over, send those to me. I would enjoy reading those. I would like to say something about the Brownstone Institute. I think that they stepped into the fray committed to calling the shots as they saw them. And they did it without some of the bluster and bombast of others. And I have found the Brownstone Institute publications to be remarkably compelling and, if you will, mind-changing, because it isn't an angry style of writing. It's here's the deal, and this is our perception, and this is the resource set that we're using to support our perception. What they really were doing was saying, there is another narrative, and you have got to at least consider it. And we promise that we will try to be intellectually honest with you and not cunning. And I think a lot of folks that typically would not have been inclined to potentially follow closely a think tank kind of group that leans right, I don't think they would have ever thought they would do that. And they are doing it, because I think there are so many Americans saying, we're learning more from reading publications from the Brownstone Institute than by sticking with our normal diet of where we get our news. And I have to tell you, Dr. Bach, for me, that's reason for optimism.
Yeah. You know, Jeffrey Tucker is the embodiment of Brownstone, and almost literally vice versa. It comes from his own ethos and drive. You know, he's endlessly curious, and he is, you know, again, like yourself, a man of integrity, and he's willing to investigate his, you know, kind of, we have a thermometer to tell somebody's temperature. We have various metrics by which we determine, you know, all things around us. But Jeffrey's is interesting because he really kind of looks deep inside himself, and he is able to gauge and manage his feelings and then come out with an essence and a thought. He's, I think, an excellent and lucid writer, but he's able to apply this across the board. So he was hugely disappointed as a libertarian himself that the other libertarians who kind of lost the let's say the first 7 letters of libertarian, liberty part, you know, like I forget his name, Nicholas Nassim Taleb or whatever his name, you know, the brilliant Black Swan guy. He had like 3 masks on and videotaping himself on a plane. It's like, okay, you know, and all these other guys who were like, you couldn't lock them down fast enough, and all these, you know, people who, you know, through their lives had questioned authority on their Volkswagen bus, you know, bumper stickers. You know, that generation, you know, just lock us down, please lock us down. You know, our bodies ourselves. Well, not now. It's just kind of a funny thing. You know, so I at this point we could segue into 2 different thoughts that occur to me as I'm speaking with you. Is A, did you get to run against the famous and now infamous, or vice versa, Tim Walz, and what was that like? And if Minnesota could have a redo, would they pick you? And do you have any aspirations in that regard? And is the only kind of prescription, no pun intended, for medicine, you know, basically a proscription against what they've been doing?
Okay, there's quite a bit to unpack there. First off, yes, I did run against Tim Walz, the Kamala Harris vice presidential candidate, and we had a pretty intense campaign, and I did lose. But I think 2 things really happened in 2022. A widely anticipated red wave did not materialize, in large part because in June of 2022, Roe v. Wade was overturned. And so issues like inflation, crime, education, price of gas and groceries, immigration policies, those things literally had to take second place to the issue of abortion. And Tim Walz had in Minnesota, a blue state, a powerful Democratic machinery with a lot of money. And give credit where credit is due. The Democratic machinery in Minnesota in 2022 took their money, painted me as an extremist, painted me almost like an aging, dark, black and white, grainy photo of Gregory Peck in a courtroom. And it was successful. What did I think of the campaign? There's so many good people in the world, so many good people in Minnesota. And I think that my biggest disappointment was that Tim Walz told Minnesotans that we would have a similar diet of debates as had occurred in the previous elections over the prior 2 decades. And then he didn't. And we had sort of a trial run at an agricultural farm fest, and Tim Walz did not do well. And I think his team told him, you need to stay off the debate stage. And so he did. And that was a disappointment because he promised me and the press that he would do this, and he did not do it. So that'd be the one thing I'd say about that. This, in terms of the specific question about me running again, it takes a ton of work. and investment and time to get to first base in a statewide race. Minnesota isn't the most populous state, obviously. I mean, we have 6 million people almost, but we have a lot of geography. We're a big state geographically. And so to literally canvass the entire state and go north, south, east, and west and get name recognition is challenging. But we did that. Our team was remarkably successful. We raised more money than any Republican gubernatorial candidate in the history of Minnesota. We got more votes than any Republican governor candidate had gotten in Minnesota. We had a higher percentage of the vote than Tim Pawlenty did in 2002 when he won, and he was the last Republican governor in Minnesota. We had hundreds of thousands of people following us on social media, and our email list was more than 100,000. So we did accomplish a lot. And for those reasons, Dr. Bach, I've been asked by many people to strongly consider running again. And my wife and I we're doing the soul searching and we're praying about it. And we understand that sometimes your own preferences in terms of your life path don't get to determine your life path. In the words of Esther 4:14, have you considered you're in the position you're in for such a time as this? Do weigh heavy on my heart. So we're very seriously thinking about running again. And I appreciate your asking. And we'll make a decision sometime in the next 6 to 9 months.
Well, you have this distinct advantage, perhaps over your putative opponent, if when you do soul searching, you actually can find one.
Thank you. When in your last question was a little more general about the people of Minnesota and, how do we right the ship, sort of? How do we do these things? I think we have to reaffirm for every human being that you don't need letters behind your name to be capable of assessing the circumstances around you and making your own choices. If I learned one thing during that COVID pandemic, it was the willingness on the part of some of my colleagues in medicine to demonize and harpoon me. And yet when I would reach out and say, could we have a cup of coffee together and just talk about this because this is crazy? There's got to be some common ground. There was no interest in that. So I think, and I thought that on social media, some of the thoughtful analyses that took place by people who were everyday folks getting up in the morning with perhaps degrees in teaching or engineering, or perhaps a work history in the trades, or perhaps owners of small businesses or restaurateurs. These people were more than capable of making good assessments. And I think that when I sit back and reflect on it, it was really disappointing that somehow we let our government collude with big tech and big pharma and convince people that they should be afraid. I think that going forward, we've got to ask ourselves the question. We have to. How much are we willing to pay for the whistle, as Ben Franklin asked? Are we really willing to lock our kids out of school and lock our fragile elderly into facilities teeming with active viral disease such that they live much more persecuted lives and die horrific, lonely deaths? Are we really willing to do that because we're fearful? And perhaps the most important thing that we can learn from all this, Dr. Bach, is Americans have to let go of their inclination to be intrinsically arrogant. We think that it's up to us in the moment to come up with intelligent concepts and understandings of what we're going through. Tony Fauci characterized it well when he basically said, if you're not following me, you're not following the science. Well, what blasphemy? Because we saw in the early 2000s SARS-1, and we saw that antibodies that were created in those people who got that disease were still present 5 years later. We saw for the last decades that cotton masks do not prevent respiratory virus transmission because their pore size opening is 50 times the size of typical respiratory viruses. We have good research from 20 years ago, and that research was done at a time when we weren't panicking. We were diligently
Absolutely.
and thoughtfully doing research, and it was being reproduced in other settings in other countries. This was good research. But in the moment of COVID, all that stuff was thrown out the window. And literally in the moment, we had charlatan scientists throwing mud on the wall to see
Yeah.
what would stick.
Well,
And we were told, ignore everything for the last 20 years because those people didn't get it. We are the ones who have the omniscience to tell you what to do. And we should never do that again.
right. I agree with you. I would like to, put in a cynical word here. I've trotted the story out a few times, but I have a friend who is a pediatrician, and he got COVID early on, maybe like March or April, and his wife did too, and his family, and they basically had kind of maybe a bad cold for a few days. They're good, all in good health, normal body weight, etc. And so I chanced upon him in the street, and we chat, and I said, well, I'm happy you got over it. What was it like? Blah, blah, blah. We did all that. And then I said, so this is a chance for you to kind of drop the mask at work. He said, no. I said, well, do you think you can get it again? He said, no. I said, do you think at this point you're cured? Can you give it to anybody? He said, no. I forgot what other questions I asked, but basically, no. There's no reason medical for him to wear this anymore. And I said, wouldn't it be a nice measure and a nice sign for your young patients and their worried moms, et cetera, to show that there's an end to this, that you get the illness, you got over it, and then you can stop wearing the mask. And he said, well, yeah, I guess so. I said, well, then are you going to stop wearing the mask? He said, no. I said, why? And basically, he said it in a couple different words, but basically he said, the bigger issue is not done yet. I said, what's that? He said, getting rid of Trump. Swear to God. And basically he was waiting for the Nancy Pelosi word on when the masks go down, because it was, being used. It was a good political, saber, for which to attack the ruling, what they saw as the real virus, Donald Trump. And that was, let's face it, that was successful. They mounted an antibody attack. And we can make a bunch of other infectious disease analogies, but basically they expelled the offending agent in their view, and they were able to weaponize the COVID experience and got their mail-in ballots. And we've seen the huge aberration and anomaly of Biden's 81 million votes while he sat in a basement, never campaigned. And so good, bravo, that was successful, but it wasn't medicine.
You make an interesting point. I thought what you were going to say was that he was continuing to wear the mask, not for political reasons, but for virtue signaling, because I think that was a part of things. And I think that's such fraught ground to talk about, because nobody wants to be accused of virtue signaling. And most people don't want to accuse others of virtue signaling because, in a sense, it undercuts their authenticity. I think we're going to have to be careful as we navigate these waters going forward, because somehow we need to find common ground between those who thought that, for the most part, the COVID policies put in place around the country and around the globe were reasonable, versus those who lifted up the courage of countries like Sweden and took great heart from what we learned from around the world. In closing a very interesting conversation, Dr. Bach, I would encourage people that if they want to boil down so much of the information into something that can be conveyed relatively quickly, I would encourage people to perhaps do a little research or just to pay attention to my comments over the next minute. From 2015 to 2019, the average number of deaths in America every year was relatively constant. It was about 2.8 million. In rough numbers, it's almost 1 out of 100 Americans die every year. That's a constant. Year to year, there's usually about 650,000 heart disease deaths. There's 600,000 cancer deaths. Those kinds of numbers, remarkably, are constant year to year. So in 2015 to 2019, 2.8 million Americans die every year. In 2020, with COVID, that number jumped to almost 3.4 million, 600,000 people. Some of those undoubtedly were COVID deaths. Some of those may have been deaths that were, if you will, scheduled to happen because of metastatic cancer or terminal heart disease or whatever. And because COVID was a consideration toward the last few days or weeks, it was put down as COVID. I'm not going to argue that point here. I'm just going to say that the number of deaths in 2020 went up 600,000, but in 2021, the vaccine now fully released. First people getting it was December of 2020, you might remember, but in 2021, the vaccine was here. Did the all-cause mortality rate drop back down towards that 2.8 million? No, it didn't. It stayed at 3.4 million. In fact, it went up. In 2022, did the death rate drop to 2.8 million or perhaps 2.9 or 3? No, it stayed in that same neighborhood. And in 2024, it seems like it's going to remain remarkably elevated above that baseline 2015 to 2019. What has happened in 2022 and 23 and 24 that has preserved this remarkably high death rate? Think of it. It should have dropped. It should have dropped because the baseline had been constant prior to COVID. But it also should have dropped because, in a sense, the people who perhaps are most fragile, who were maybe most likely to pass in the 3 to 5 years from 2020 to 2024, they've passed. They had much higher risk because perhaps they were in their 90s or even hundreds. They had end-stage heart disease and metastatic cancers. Arguably, some of the weakest among us have passed. And wouldn't that bring the number back down to the baseline? And it's not. And so I would just ask you, what do you think could be causing the persistent elevation of all-cause mortality in our country and countries across the globe?
Yeah.
And I am not going to avoid the hard thing here, Dr. Bach. I'm going to tell you, I think we have to ask ourselves, is it our remarkable obesity rate in the United States and our potentially tainted food chain? Or is it something such as vaccine side effects?
Right.
Or is it something that we haven't considered? But by George, Americans, I think we've got to think about this.
Yeah. No, I think there's some, I'll have to go look at the death rates data. Maybe we'll post that as an ancillary to this. I think it may not satisfy the entire difference, but there's been an increase in deaths of despair as well. Basically narcotic opioid overdose deaths. I think in general, people, when they despair, they do less well for their own health. It's funny, you as a man of faith, that the FDA and whatever kind of health conscious, food conscious organizations are out there, they're always, I guess in schools, they tell kids about diet this and don't smoke, so forth. As far as longevity goes, actually feeling good is probably a better, not just prognosticator, but potent driver towards both longevity and enjoying your longevity. So church going, marriage actually add more healthful years than practically almost any other food directive or cautionary item that we're always scolded about for health. So if they had kind of the interest in being balanced, they might have whatever the current version of the food pyramid is, and don't smoke, but also get married and be part of the community, go to church, contribute and so forth. Because not only do you live longer, but you actually provide benefit to others around you to greater extent, and you bring life to the fore. But it's just kind of always seemed to me kind of a missing element that our quote unquote public health ignores the huge drivers of not just longevity, but useful life and satisfied life. And they're always kind of materialist in the sense of caring about minutia. And I'm not against eating the right foods and all that kind of stuff, and I don't smoke, et cetera, et cetera. I try to maintain body weight, blah blah blah. But the bigger, better things are to enjoy your life and to bring joy, genuine joy, to other people's lives insofar as you can or able to. But I think we're rounding out the hour, and I thank you for your efforts. You've clearly gone above and beyond in your own efforts. I want to give people a chance to help find you. So I'm going to pop up your webpage here, and hopefully they'll get a chance to do so if I am competent here. Let's see. There we go. I think you can see that. So this is Scott Jensen, a little picture of Minnesota behind, and there's a bunch of these unfortunate, they've thrown everything. I mean, where have we heard of this? Where the state throws all kinds of lawsuits against a political candidate? I can't remember when I heard of this last, but it seems to be a part of the playbook, to sully people and see what they can get away with. I find that kind of reprehensible, but a sad sign of the times. At least you have the proper scarlet letter. So I know you have a book out. I couldn't find your book. Can you tell us how to find your book?
Thank you for asking. The best way to do it is to reach out to actually my medical clinic, because our web page for buying the book is temporarily down. And so if people just wanted to just basically call Catalyst Medical Clinic and at 952-955-1963, they'll go ahead and take care of you basically with a credit card and mail it out. 952-955-1963. I wrote 2 books. One was Relationship Matters, and that was about 9 years ago. And that's all about the high value of a patient and a doctor having a functional working relationship together, where the doctor advocates for the patient and the patient learns through that advocacy of the doctor, the patient learns to trust the doctor. And then the second book was We've Been Played, and that was written during the pandemic. And I think we've been played. I think we've been played by a triad of tyranny, and that's big government and big tech and big pharma. When they share a mission, and when they share their power and their capabilities, I think that it's safe to say we've been played.
Well, thank you so much. So last self-promotion here. If people want to help support my podcast or me in general, or save the world, as it were, they can buy my book. It's called Overturning Zika. You may not remember. It's not that Zima or Zine or whatever. Zika was the greatest pandemic to its time in 2016. Somewhat been eclipsed by this COVID thing, but it's the overturning Zika, the pandemic that never was. It's a fascinating topic. How do I know that? Because, frankly, I was fascinated by it. I'm not a Zika expert. I'm not an infectious disease or anything like that. But this thing came on the scene, and then it frankly just disappeared like a comet. And it was a big deal. Rio Olympics, all this kind of stuff. I'm not going to go too far into it to spend much more of our time together. But I think people should look into it, because it became a fascinating object of fascination for me in 2019 when I noticed it disappeared. And dengue, I mean, Zika is a dengue, and dengue's never caused microcephaly. And there are millions of cases of dengue throughout Brazil. And none of the other flaviviruses ever had. And somehow Zika did, but it all stopped. And Dr. Fauci plays a role in this as well. Hilarity ensues. I'll let people look it up, but it's an amazing phenomenon. It's kind of a tulip mania in the medical world. It's a panic that took hold, and partially, in a sense, macabrely, because it was seen as a tool by the left to overturn the abortion constraints in Brazil and beyond. And so Latin America kind of remains relatively conservative, pro-life, and statutorily. And people wanted to use Zika microcephaly as a way of just kind of, with a stroke of a pen, as that phrase goes, getting rid of any abortion constraints. And so it was taken up probably way beyond, hitting above its weight class or over its pay scale as an illness, because it wasn't really Zika microcephaly. There was really probably no Zika microcephaly per se. There never was. But nobody's gone back. Nobody's retracted that. So buy the book. I think I've tried to make it readable for a general audience. Tell me what you think, and there you have it. So thank you, Dr. Jensen. Appreciate your bravery. I'm pretty sure I contributed to one of your candidacies. I would be happy to do so again. I recommend others do so as well. So thank you so much, and have a great day.
Thank you, Dr. Bach.